Ladies and gentlemen, we now have the keynote speaker for this evening, Excellency Yasumasa Nagamine, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, Japan. We have been talking through this whole morning about Asian connectivity issues, and the Secretary Jaishankar, when he spoke in the morning answering question, mentioned the very dynamic relationship between Japan and India that has been proving critical to furthering connectivity in the region. So I would request Excellency Yasumasa Nagamine to address this gathering, about the Indo-Japan relationship in the larger context of connectivity, and also perhaps he could talk about the larger G7 agenda which lies ahead and what Japan sees developing through that. Over to you, sir.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Mr. Sanjay Joshi, Director, ORF, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And my name is Nagamine. I'm a Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan. And the bio on the booklet and the bio over there ignore a very important fact that I was one time a minister, economic minister of the Embassy of Japan in New Delhi between year 1998 to the year 2001. And then I remember that I took my family with me from Japan to Delhi, and this is the hotel where we started our life in New Delhi for 2.5 years at the time. And I went back with a very fond memories of the life and the work here in Delhi. So I am very honored to have the opportunity to speak in front of you today. And I would like to commend the Indian government for initiating this Raisina Dialogue. I think it is truly meet the need for the times, for we definitely need a venue for a free exchange of views on how to shape the future of the Indo-Pacific region. I wish every success of this dialogue in the future. At this important juncture of the beginning of this Raisina Dialogue, it should be very important that the Japan-India relationship should be well recognized and situated in this kind of a coverage of the dialogue as a positive contributor to peace and prosperity of the region and to the world for the matter. So I would like to begin by reviewing bilateral relationship between Japan and India in a very short account. The Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has frequently stated that the Japan-India partnership is a bilateral relationship with the largest potential for growth. It is because of the very important role Japan and India can play as the two major democracies in Asia. Prime Minister Abe's visit to Delhi and the meeting with Prime Minister Modi in December 2015 yielded many results that opened the way to a new era in Japan-India relations. As stated in the Japan-India Vision 2025, Japan and India are determined to cooperate to realize a region that is rooted in universal values. Also, it states that Japan and India will promote broad cooperation in security, economic, culture, and other areas towards this goal, and to pursue cooperation with major partners who share the same views. I think the selection of Japan's high-speed rail technologies we call it a Shinkansen system, for the Mumbai-Ahmedabad route, as well as the agreement in principle on the text of the agreement on the cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, show our strong desire for closer cooperation between Japan and India. Strong India is good for Japan, and strong Japan is good for India. Another remarks by Prime Minister Abe. Advances in economic relations between Japan and India are also vital to regional prosperity, and it must be actively pursued. The Japanese economy is regaining its strength through Abenomics, and our efforts will continue despite the Business Times article today with the word of slowdown. Prime Minister Modi is actively promoting initiatives such as Make in India, Clean India, and Digital India that are necessary for India's future. And Japan is strongly committed to support these efforts. More than 1,200 Japanese companies have opened their business footholds in India, and expect that number to continue to rise to 5 digits. Japan and India will further cooperate in improving investment conditions as well as developing infrastructure to strengthen this trend. Developments of Japanese industrial township is an example, and I hope that we can put in place as many concrete steps possible by the time Prime Minister Modi visits Japan later this year, under the agreement of having a leader's visit each year. It is also very important for Japan and India to prosper with other countries in the region. As global value chains spread, both India and Southeast Asia can prosper by having closer connectivity. India and Japan are in position to work together to implement projects that reinforce regional connectivity towards this end. We look forward to further deepening bilateral relations with wider scope. Ladies and gentlemen, now I'd like to turn to another subject already introduced, Japan's active contribution to peace and prosperity through the process of a G7 summit. Japan will host the G7 summit in Ise-shima area. It's located in Mie Prefecture in Japan on May 26th and 27th. We will lead the world as the presidency of the G7, which consists of countries sharing the fundamental values of freedom, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And by discussing issues and presenting the best path for regional and global peace and prosperity from a global perspective. G7, as you know, is an annual leaders forum of democratic advanced economies, Europe, Japan, the United States, and Canada, starting from 1975. In G7 Ise-shima Summit, the leaders will conduct in-depth discussions, first on global economy and trade, second, political and security issues, third, climate change and energy as global issues, and fourth, development issues. Let me elaborate one by one a little bit further. Global economy, which is faced with a growing uncertainty due to slowdowns in emerging market economies, especially in China, the decline in crude oil prices, weaker trade, the effects of normalization of monetary policy by the United States is a major issue facing the international community. The G7 countries need to send a positive message on global economic growth and measures against the downside risks at the G7 Ise-shima Summit in May. G20 finance ministers met recently in Shanghai and issued a communique. I think that is a good kind of a common approach to the issues of a global economy right now. And we should attentively follow the further development and then making a good, positive contribution at the time of G7 summit. Second, diplomatic and security issues. We expect in-depth discussion will take place at the G7 summit on counterterrorism and Middle East situation, the refugee issues, the Ukrainian situation, the North Korean situation, to name a few. We will have G7 foreign ministers meeting in April in Hiroshima, paving the way for G7 summit meeting in Hiroshima in May. Thirdly, climate and energy. On climate change, COP21 held in December last year adopted the Paris Agreement as the first new global framework after Kyoto Protocol. I would like to note that the Prime Minister Abe made a contribution to reaching an agreement with the promise to increase climate assistance to developing countries by 1.3 trillion yen contribution by 2020 and mobilize commitments of $100 billion per year from advanced economies together. We are encouraged with the success of the COP21. Japan and India both contributed very much to the success of COP21, and this year's task is to make into the new phase of a signature and ratification of the Paris Agreement in order to have an earlier implementation. Furthermore, on the establishment of energy security remains a pressing issue for the international community in light of the dramatic changes in global energy conditions such as continued decline in crude oil prices and geopolitical instability. G7 countries are expected to play a leading role in the area of energy policy, which also relates to climate change issues. Fourthly, development. G7 summit is the first summit after the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which contains the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Global partnership with the stakeholders, participants, including the private sector and civil society, is vital for implementation of the agenda. G7 must proactively lead actions on the 2030 Agenda, including SDGs, within the framework of this partnership. In August this year, Japan, together with the UN, UNDP, World Bank, and the African Union Commission, will co-organize the 6th Tokyo Conference, International Conference on Africa Development in Kenya, called TICAD. And TICAD offers an opportunity for the entire international community to discuss development in Africa, and Japan is aiming for effective collaboration with the G7 in May. Well, besides those 4 topics described above, Japan plans to shed light on and lead initiatives by the international community for the promotion of 3 areas: promotion of women's active role, the quality infrastructure investment, and international health at the summit. These are also areas where India is actively involved, and Japan hopes that the outcomes of the summit will assist India's efforts to those ends. First, women. G7 Ise-shima Summit aims to bolster international momentum for promoting participation of women in all fields with themes of empowerment of women, including education and promotion of women's active role in natural sciences and the technology areas, so-called STEM, S-T-E-M, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Secondly, promotion of quality infrastructure investment. It is estimated that the demand-supply gap for global infrastructure investments amounts to $1 trillion per year. Investment must take not only short-term and quantitative view, but also a longer-term and qualitative perspective. Prime Minister Abe announced the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure in May 2015. The G7 summit will communicate the importance of implementing quality infrastructure investments that contribute to sustainable growth to the world and discuss contribution that can be made by G7 countries. Finally, international health. Perhaps you remember that the summit in 2000 in Kyushu, Okinawa, we addressed the issue of core topic and of the health. And then Global Fund for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis was established 2 years later. The Toyako summit in 2008 also reached an agreement on comprehensive efforts to strengthen healthcare system, including infectious disease measures and maternal and child healthcare. The G7 Iseshima summit this year intends to discuss responses to public health emergencies following the lesson learned from the Ebola outbreak and other cases, and the establishment of lifelong healthcare services from maternal and child care to lifestyle diseases and aging, with the goal of promoting universal health coverage. Ladies and gentlemen, I have tried to give you an idea as to on what subjects and in what way Japan intends to promote discussions at the Iseshima summit in May. We intend to bring in focus on Asia in the summit, believing that the outcome of the summit should be directly a relevance to Asia-Pacific region and the Asia and India-Asia regions. I will do my best, being a Sherpa of the summit meeting, preparing for the summit, but I look forward to interacting with you on the way to the summit, listening to your views, and then reflecting the Asian perspective into the summit. And also, I look forward to coming back and share the outcome of the summit of G7 after it finalized, and then again, getting your views known to us. So I very much like to use this opportunity to interact with you. The process, a very important process for Japan's diplomacy this year for G7. But the G7 is not the G7 alone. G7's connectivity with the world, connectivity with this region is very much focused and very much taken into account. So that concludes my remarks at the outset. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you so much, Excellency. In this very, very brief presentation, you just took about 12 minutes. You've given us an extremely broad-ranging presentation. I don't think it could have been more broad-ranging, covering, of course, the Indo-Japan relationship. You've been speaking about everything that is happening between Japan and India and how it is relevant to connectivity. And then you've gone on to explaining the G7 agenda, which you hope to develop. And interestingly, it is some of the key areas which are of interest to Asia, women's empowerment, infrastructure development, growth, and of course, global health. Now, we have some short time for questions. We are running out of time, so it's going to be brief. First question, I have Vindu Malchotani, please.
Nagamine-san, Prime Minister Abe recently mentioned that a strong India is good for Japan. So in this context, I wanted your views or Japan's views on India's expanding strategic role in the Pacific. Thank you.
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Can you hear?
Prime Minister Abe had mentioned that a strong India is good for Japan. And in this context, I wanted your views on India's expanding strategic role in the Pacific region.
Mm-hmm. Will you correct some?
Yeah, Prime Minister, can we go to the next question? Yeah. Yes, Channel. Could you get to a mic?
Okay. Shall I go? Yeah. Thank you, Sanjay.
Mayor Sharma?
Yeah, thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Mr. Minister. The question that I had was that you mentioned that there's $1 trillion a year gap deficit in infrastructure financing or need for infrastructure financing. Japan has done a great deal to fill this need, not just in India, but also in Southeast Asia. But most of what Japan has done has been bilateral. Now, standing in India, we desperately need to increase our connectivity with Southeast Asia, with Iran, et cetera, et cetera. I was just wondering, why is it not possible for our bilateral investment relationship to be transformed over time into something more multilateral, and which allows India to embed itself into Southeast Asia using the good offices of Japanese diplomacy and its know-how about investment?
Yes, gentlemen.
Vinod Sehgal is the name. Minister, you had outlined the agenda for G7 that you hope to address. I have a small suggestion that today, when you take these decisions, there will be policy directives of G7, but it requires financing. Some of the multinationals today have a war chest running into trillions of dollars, just 5 or 6 of them in America. I suggest you make them as observers, because you will require financing from 1 or 2 issues that you have raised that coincide with what the Millennium Development Goals require, for example, health. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question. Just time for one last question. Smita from India Today.
Mr. Minister, first of all, as far as the India-Japan current relationship is concerned, how much of it do you think is driven on the basis of consensus across party lines, and how much of it being driven individually by Mr. Shinzo Abe? And B, despite the border conflict with China, the Sino-India trade is much higher than the Indo-Japanese trade. So what does India really have to gain by getting drawn into these maritime exercises and being seen as ganging up with US and Japan against China, and bringing home the South China Sea conflict closer than it really is?
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you very much for a variety of questions. The first question is referred to the Prime Minister Abe's remarks of strong India is good for Japan. Perhaps I try to elaborate what it really aimed at. We are very much impressed with the high growth of India, and then India is more and more kind of open economy, contributing to the global economy in a big way. And then I think that kind of a strong economy of India will in turn give a kind of a strength of Japan's economy. And then it's not just the economic front, but more comprehensively will contribute to the Japan-India relationship. I think that is what it is meant by what he said, that strong India is good for Japan. But certainly the other side is equally true. Strong Japan is good for India. We try our kind of best in getting out of the deflation economy and moving to the expanding phase of the economy and contributing to the international economy. I think that kind of trend will in turn contribute to the growth of India, and then again having a spillover effect over to other areas as well. That's my kind of interpretation and my conviction. And the second question relates to the infrastructure building gap to fill, and then through bilateral aid, but rather recommending to get into the sort of multilateral side. If I understand the question correctly, perhaps a multilateral means more to the kind of projects connecting the region, not just one country. I took that question that way. I think if it is the question, in fact, then I would certainly agree to that. And the government of Japan and the JICA is moving to that area very much. The connectivity projects and the connecting sort of projects, or kind of infrastructure building, connecting the two countries or two regions by road, by ship, by air services, and so forth, and then establishing a installation of the border. That sort of projects are very much incoming. Of course, all the projects funded by the official public fund must take into all the necessary criterion. But I think the connectivity projects will take a kind of priority and the preference side. So I think those projects will be on the rise. And the third question is perhaps the G7's role in the financing.
And getting some multilateral, private sector and other participants in as observers or into the G7 because of the financing requirements. It's related to the first one, really.
Yes. Well, of course, the G7 countries, advanced democratic countries, are responsible for the issues of development and sharing the kind of directive, sharing the direction of development with global community, but at the same time sharing the role of financing of building such a future in the world. And the G7 meeting itself is not itself a kind of pledging session for specific projects, but overall direction will be discussed so that that will be followed by the efforts to gather financial requirements in one way or another. But I would take the view into account, but I would say that the summit itself is not for the collecting money itself. But the final question is relating to the maritime issue. Maybe earlier panelists discussed that issue more in detail. But what we are focusing on the maritime security is that the use of the sea should be very much guided by the international norm, where the stipulation of the role of, or the responsibility and the right of the coast, the countries, and also the right and the obligation of the navigating state has been well founded in the law of the sea convention. So every party should be abided by the norms of the international law. And then that is a kind of one part of the discussion, I believe. And the kind of maritime exercise by self-defense forces or the Navy has been conducted according to the requirement of their sort of security needs. And that has been traditionally done. That is nothing very much dramatic, but it has to be reflected, the situation at the present time. So there is a rationale for doing that, but all these exercises and every activities should be guided by the international norms, which I have referred to earlier. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency. The India-Japan relationship is actually based on India's, deepest political and economic impulses. That is the strength of this relationship and why it has been progressing the way it is. I want to thank you for being here with us and spending time answering the questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.